Right, Darren. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Carbon Tracker webinar, Electric Drive to Survive. My name is Harry Benham. I'm going to be moderating this event. I'm just going to outline a little bit of what it's about and a little bit of how the day is going to work. And then I'm going to be passing to Ben Scott, who's going to be driving a presentation before and we'll be introducing the panel. And then we'll get into a Q&A session. So the session today is called Electric Drive to Survive. It's going to cover work that we've been doing in the transport sector, both in Carbon Tracker and in New Automotive. The interesting point about this is what's turning out to be the very non-linear, very disruptive way that the electric vehicle increase occurring in the automotive sector. Possibly what should have been just a sustaining technology going from petrol engines to batteries should have been potentially straightforward for the automotive industry, but it's not turning out that way. It's turning out to be very disruptive, and we're going to discuss that. Ben Scott from Carbon Tracker is going to be discussing a report he's written called Slipped Gear, which goes into some of the details for why this is a disruption and what's happening to the main players. And there's a blog that we've produced as well in combination with New Automotive and Carbon Tracker that looks into the details of this in a little bit more. So I'm going to now pass over to Ben Scott, who's going to introduce himself from Carbon Tracker, and the panelists, Lauren, Claire, and Ben Nelson from Auto are going to introduce themselves as well. We'll then get into the presentation itself from Ben Scott, who will be going through the report and some of the key issues for why this is important, who are the winners and losers, and we think is going to happen over the next few years in the automotive sector. And then there'll be a Q&A session that's likely to last about 40 minutes, the bulk of this. So please put into the Q&A section here your questions based on this and anything else you want to talk about. We'll try and get around them today. We'll try and get into them and answer them live. The panelists will take them. And then if we can't do that, we'll follow up with you as long as you've left us your email address, etc. And we can get back to you and catch up on anything we may have missed today. So without further ado, thank you for everybody joining. Thanks for taking your time. And I'll pass to Ben Scott to take us to start introducing the panel and then start introducing the reports. Thanks very much.
Good morning, thank you, Harry. So my name is Ben Scott. I'm a senior analyst with Carbon Tracker, and I'm looking at the automotive sector. I've been researching the automotive sector now for the last 11 or 12 years across research consulting within the industry and also within the banking and finance as well. And I'll hand over to Lauren.
Hi all, Lauren Pammer. I'm a Programme Director at the Green Finance Institute, and I lead a coalition for the decarbonisation of road transport. So we're looking at how finance can be the enabler of the transition to net zero. I'll pass over to Claire.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, I'm Claire Miller. I've been at Octopus Electric Vehicles for just over 4 years. Was Director of Tech and Innovation and now an advisor there. I've spent the last 4 years delivering on 2 really big and interesting projects of work, which are coming together, I think, in this webinar. So one of those is vehicle to grid in a domestic setting, and the other of those is actually founding a leasing company focused on electric vehicles. So hoping to bring some insights from both sides of my world from the last few years to this. Thanks for having us, Ben. Ben Nelms, there you go.
Sure, thank you. And I'm Ben Nelms. I'm Chief Executive at New Automotive. We're a UK-based non-profit using data to help accelerate and support the transition to electric vehicles.
All right, thanks, panelists. I'll pass Ben Scott. Can we pass to you now for the briefing, and then we'll start opening it to the floor and the panelists. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, Harry, and yeah, good morning to everyone. As I mentioned, my name is Ben Scott. I'm a senior analyst with Carbon Tracker, and it's a pleasure to present to you today the findings from a recent report I published called Slipped Gear. And I've got about eight or 9 slides to go through today, and then we'll move into the panel session where there'll be plenty of time for questions and to engage in discussion. And if you want to contact me after this event, my email address is on the screen now. So as a brief summary to the analysis I'll be talking about today, At the end of last year, I completed company profiles for 20 of the largest automakers, and this covers about 85% of global vehicle production. And I provided comprehensive analysis on their alignment to the Paris Agreement and their position relative to the automotive energy transition. Slips Gear is the overarching narrative report across those 20 profiles. And both the 20 profiles and the Slip Gear report are available to download for free on the Carbon Tracker website. Before we jump straight into the report findings, I wanted to share with you another piece of analysis that we did with our partners, New Automotive, to kind of set the scene. And on screen now, we're showing the adoption of battery electric vehicles in the UK. And we believe this is closely following an S-curve function. So by the end of this year, we are expecting EV sales to make up about 1/3 of all new sales. And such is the S-curve, this adoption rate will rapidly increase. And just 1 year after that, by end of 2024 and beginning of 2025, this will move to 1 in 2 sales being pure electric. And I think this shows the speed of the automotive energy transition. And this is happening at a faster rate than many people expect. And as Harry mentioned at the top of the hour, this is non-linear. This is a non-linear adoption. So this is something to think about as I go through the rest of the slides. And clearly this is shaking up the business of the incumbent OEMs, and they need to shift and adapt in order to survive this energy transition. And we'll talk about what OEMs are doing and not doing as we go through the rest of this deck. Now turning to the analysis from the Slip Gear report, looking first at automaker net zero targets. In general, most automakers have targets to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at the latest, according to their annual and corporate sustainability reports. And while these companies recognize that to align with the Paris Agreement, zero and low carbon vehicles need to be produced and sold to minimize Scope 3 emissions, quantifying their greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy is lacking. Broadly speaking, OEM interim emissions reduction are weak, with either no mention of short to mid-term targets or how they align with a 1.5 degree C warming scenario. So therefore, lacking credibility. Short-term and mid-term targets are important. They're important milestones to enable an orderly automotive energy transition and will improve the likelihood of meeting longer-term net zero goals. So on the slide now, this summarizes how Carbon Tracker has rated each OEM's short, mid, and long-term emissions reductions plan. Generally speaking, European OEMs have the best quality of emissions reduction targets, followed by US OEMs, and then lastly, the Asian manufacturers. So another way to think about this is that these net zero targets are also an indication on OEM survival as a business. If a company does not have a joined up or credible net zero target or strategy, i.e. they're not effectively switching from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, then their business is at risk because they're not planning for a zero emission future where internal combustion engine products that they produce now are going to be obsolete. So to summarize, an OEM with poor net zero targets is one that may not survive the automotive energy transition. And what does this mean in terms of transitioning manufacturing assets to produce electric cars? The chart on screen now shows battery electric vehicle production as a percentage of global vehicle production capacity versus battery electric vehicle production in units for 2021. And just to make you aware, the bottom axis, the x-axis is a log scale, just to make you aware of that. So incumbent automotive manufacturers, they must manage two sets of assets, one for producing internal combustion engine vehicles and one to produce electric cars. And this can be a challenge, as OEMs must balance the profitability from internal combustion engine vehicles against emissions targets and net zero goals. So although on paper some OEMs may have a well thought out plan to reach net zero, as discussed in the last slide, overall the incumbent manufacturers have been slow to convert their assets towards battery electric vehicles. And of the 20 manufacturers assessed in this report, most have less than 5% of global vehicle production capacity geared up to produce battery electric vehicles as of 2021. So there are some exceptions here. The exceptions are some of the Chinese manufacturers who have a smaller asset base, therefore it's easier to transition to producing battery electric vehicles. So the likes of SAIC or BYD, and they have less of an ICE legacy as well. On the other end of the scale, you have the likes of Toyota and Mitsubishi who are way behind in terms of transitioning their asset base to producing electric cars. Another aspect I looked at in this report is financial disclosure within the financial statements and annual reports. Transparent financial disclosure and recognizing climate risk in financial statements is critical to enable an orderly automotive energy transition. And by continuing with business as usual and not taking climate-related matters into account, this could lead to overstated assets, understated liabilities, and overstated profits. And this puts business operations at risk. So recognizing climate risks is key to implementation of strategies to meet emissions reduction targets, i.e. the deployment of electric vehicles, as well as ensuring that the business continues as a going concern. One thing we looked at first was climate assumptions. Overall, automotive manufacturers have poor financial alignment with the Paris Agreement. So while some companies took climate-related estimates or assumptions into consideration, none of the companies explicitly disclosed them. Turning to green revenues, only 3 companies, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Kia, disclosed their green revenues. And by green revenues I mean revenues from low carbon vehicles. And you know, of these 3 companies, only Mercedes-Benz mentioned a target to actually increase these revenues. Now, a possible reason that green revenues is not shown is because it is sensitive information, and companies do not want to reveal to competitors the top line revenues that they're making from battery vehicles. And then lastly, looking at assets, and this is an important one. Of the companies assessed, there is limited transparency on decarbonising capital expenditure on assets. 2 companies, Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz, disclosed capital expenditure for low or zero carbon technology as a percentage of absolute value. However, none of the companies assessed disclosed how they will align capital expenditure plans with greenhouse gas targets or how they're going to phase out expenditure in internal combustion engine assets. And there was also no information about retiring of internal combustion engine assets, so the property, plant and equipment, which is a major asset stranding risk in the midterm as the automotive energy transition ramps up. And this is because ICE vehicles will become a stranded product, and in turn this leads to stranded assets. Some elements of the ICE vehicle production process, like paint shops and body stamping, will still be relevant to produce electric cars. They're agnostic to the powertrain, but the production lines that build internal combustion engines and the vehicles and the associated R&D facilities will soon become obsolete again, turning into stranded assets. So automakers, they either need to convert, sell, or shut down factories producing internal combustion engine vehicles. And most OEMs, I would say, are doing the former and converting property, plant and equipment from ICE assets to EV assets. However, as a result of the automotive energy transition, in many cases, ICE asset useful lives will be much shorter than originally anticipated due to obsolescence, likely leading to asset stranding and write-downs. And recently, within the last week or so, Renault's CEO announced that the Euro 7 proposal, which is a tightening up of European engine legislation, emissions legislation, would mean a reduction in the new car market by between 7 and 10%, meaning a closure of up to 4 vehicle factories. And it's these type of disclosures that we want to see in the financials and annual reports. If you move on to policy now, as many of you will know, from 2020, automakers selling vehicles into the EU are subject to fleet average emissions targets, which will directly contribute to the achievement of the EU's commitments under the Paris Agreement by regulating Scope 3 emissions. So essentially, in a given year, automakers must comply with vehicle fleet mass adjusted average tailpipe emissions targets, or they face heavy penalty fines. And each automaker has a different target because of the difference in fleet mass. To meet compliance with these rules, automakers must deploy battery electric vehicles because they have zero tailpipe emissions. And this will lower fleet average emissions. And compliance with this regulation is actually a good proxy for Paris Agreement alignment in the EU region. From 2025, the target becomes 15% stricter, and then 55% stricter by 2030. It used to be 37.5% stricter, it's now moved to 55% stricter. And then this culminates in a 100% reduction in CO2 tailpipe emissions by 2035. So effectively, this is a ban on the internal combustion engine. So under the rules of the regulation, automakers are allowed to pool or combine fleet emissions with other automakers, and you can see on the slide here which automakers pooled with which. And OEMs form these emissions pools to meet EU emissions compliance and are reliant on certain manufacturers or brands to bring down the pool's average emissions. And while permitted by the EU regulation, the pooling benefits the OEM laggards who have not invested enough in electrification to meet emissions compliance as a standalone entity. So the OEM needing to lower their fleet average CO2 emissions will pay their pooling partner for these emissions credits. And we believe this is capital that could have been better used to develop electric vehicle products. So this pooling loophole is almost like a get out of jail free card to help manufacturers who are not as advanced in electrification as others. Because ultimately EU policy isn't looking to put companies out of business, but as we go up the S-curve of electric vehicle adoption, which we talked about at the beginning, those loopholes will quickly close. So the incumbent OEMs are using the cash flow generated from their internal combustion engine vehicle operations to fund the transition to e-mobility. And ICE vehicle production has become a highly refined and efficient process with tangible and intangible assets depreciated or amortized over a long period of time. And producing electric vehicles to meet legislative and consumer demands is actually quite a relatively new requirement. So as such, producing and selling internal combustion engine vehicles is typically more profitable than it is for electric cars. And the incumbent OEMs are therefore dependent on the ICE profits to maximize returns for shareholders, but they also need this cash flow to fund their energy transition. So an immediate shift to 100% electrification cannot be expected, but an accelerated transition should be urged. So this is my last slide before we go to the panel and audience Q&A. But just a few points to finalise here. First point here is that the EV market is legitimised now, and sales are rapidly increasing, and we believe it's following this S-curve of adoption. Automaker net zero plans are a survival plan. So if a company does not have a joined up or credible net zero target or strategy, i.e. they are not effectively switching from internal combustion to electric vehicles, then their business is at risk because they are not planning for a zero emission future where the ICE products that they produce now will become obsolete. European and global emissions legislation is only getting stricter. While OEM laggards can use certain loopholes to be emissions compliant, they will quickly close as we approach the 2030s. The laggards, the manufacturers who don't invest in electrification now and who aren't transitioning their asset base fast enough will struggle to keep up and will fall further and further behind. You know, as I've said a few times now, the pace of the automotive energy transition is speeding up. We're following that S-curve, and the incumbent automakers who hold the largest market share now, they have the most to lose in the future. And lastly here, you know, stranded products lead to stranded assets, and ICE assets could very easily become obsolete in the midterm. So we're now going to move on to the panel session and audience QA, and I'm going to hand back now to Harry to kind of kick us off.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. The slide you'll see in front of you, everybody, is just a quick summary of all the slides that you've seen to maybe prompt questions. We've had a few coming in, and we had a few ahead of the actual session. Also on the left-hand side, you'll see some frequently asked questions that we tend to get involved with in sessions like this and from our reports. And you can read them for yourselves, but things like what about hybrids, battery materials, range anxiety, charging infrastructure, etc. They might prompt some questions from you as well, which the panel has been assembled to answer. So in terms of the first question, this is one that came in ahead of the actual webinar itself. Looking at that S-curve again, which is a prominent part of the presentation. On the S-curve that we've talked about, the question is, can you talk us through some of the assumptions that went into that analysis and how you came about them? And I'm going to, if I may, pass that to Ben Nelms, because that was a new automotive piece of work that we worked with Carbon Tracker on, and Ben is the CEO, so he's probably best placed to talk about that. But then after that, if any of the other panelists want to chat about it, so over to you, Ben, on that one, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Harry. I noticed we do have one question from the audience about whether or not Ivan Toney has an EV.
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but I know Ben Mee does. Anyway. So,
okay,
anyway,
I'll answer
sorry.
the Ivan Toney one. I'm sorry, but that's a very esoteric question.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I refer that one to Harry. All matters brand. So look, on the S-curve chart that you can see on that summary slide, you know, I think that piece of work relates to a debate that we're always having in the automotive about the nature of the transition to zero-emission cars, which is whether or not it will be like the rise of a new technology like the smartphone, which will follow an S-curve, or typically follows an S-curve, whether it's going to be more like a commodity transition where you have gradually declining demand, but often a hardcore of baseload demand that never really goes away or struggles to go anywhere. So let's suppose that the transition is following an S-curve, you know, in car sales. I guess the question we wanted to answer was, well, what sort of S is it? What does it look like? You know, you can draw S's in lots of different ways. And if you're the government designing a ZEV mandate, it looks more like a sort of flattened Z. But so this plot is the result of a piece of work that my colleague Gianluca Boni carried out, looking at taking UK car sales data and then fitting it to an S-curve. So trying to find out what sort of S best fits the data so far, and then what does that tell us about what the future might look like. And as you you will have been able to see, I think you probably can't see from the slide currently on the screen, but the result is displayed on that graph. And it roughly aligns with the UK government's ambition to end sales of petrol and diesel cars from 2030 and hybrids from 2035. And I think if we, it's just using UK data. If we zoom out from the UK, I think there's a couple of interesting lessons for the rest of the world. The first lesson is the vital role that government policy plays. The UK has had a government that has stood behind this transition for a number of years, latterly in supplier regulations, like the ending of the ambition to end sales by 2030 of ICE vehicles, but also with tax incentives and grants and fiscal incentives as well. And looking around the world, actually, you can see there's quite a patchy range of policies in place. And so, whether or not that S-curve is going to play out around the rest of the world, I think depends largely on whether or not we're going to see more governments adopting approaches, like the European Union has, like China has, with supplier regulations that are going to drive or embed phase-out dates in policy and regulation. If I could have my way, I'd have that in every country in the world, with a system of tradable obligations that sits behind these ambitions to give the manufacturers the flexibilities, but also the imperative to make that transition. And I think then we'd start to see global sales following the similar sort of S-curve that we see on that plot. But yeah, there's just a couple of reflections on sort of how we arrived at it. Oh, Harry, I believe you're on mute.
Well, on mute. Classic. Thanks, Ben, for that, and thanks for answering the Brentford question. Any panelists want to add to that on the S-curve and the assumptions there? If not, we've got a number of questions coming in, so I'll sort of take these in order, if I may, and then we've got yes, a few to look at here from an anonymous attendee. Which are the most important emissions reduction targets for auto companies to set in terms of scope and time scale? Ben, Scott, can I pass that to you and then to the other panelist members to respond to that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think as I alluded to at the beginning of the session, I think all of the reduction targets are important. We talked a little bit about the short, mid, and long-term targets, and we believe that it's important to have targets for kind of each of those milestones to enable a smooth transition and a credible one. One thing I didn't talk about, but it's on the slide right now, is what our automakers saying in terms of their zero emissions vehicle pledge, which some automakers pledged to during COP26. So some automakers said that they'll only sell electric vehicles globally by 2035 or 2040, but other manufacturers didn't sign up to that, which I think tells a lot about a company's strategy and then how they're going to meet emissions targets. Because the worrying thing is that in the developed world, an automaker might commit to only sell electric vehicles, but in the global south, then they may still want to sell those internal combustion engine vehicles. So very much having a long tail end to the internal combustion engine vehicle, and ultimately, if that is the case, then we're going to shoot way past 1.5 degrees C of global warming.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for that. Any other additions to that from the panel?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Just a reflection
Sure.
on some of these kind of commitments to targets, and what's potentially underpinning some of that is that we need to take into consideration where the electricity is coming from, which is being used to manufacture these vehicles. And so, just a little kind of sidebar on the Chinese electricity grid, if I may. There are nearly 3,000 coal burning plants in China right now. Something like 2/3 of the energy in China comes from burning coal and gas, and that's projected to drop to only 44% by 2030. So if you keep that in mind, all of those vehicles that are being manufactured in China, a huge amount of their energy consumption to make those vehicles is coming from burning coal and gas. So I think it's not surprising to see that they're not making promises on that front in terms of their manufacture. And so I think in terms of this zoomed out view of where companies are making commitments, we've got to consider, say, where their energy is coming from and which markets are decarbonising their electricity grid fast and as fast as the manufacturing kind of world needs it to. And I guess that brings us back to the UK, where our grid is rapidly decarbonising. We've seen an incredible drop in the use of burning fossil fuels. So we're doing a really great job in the UK, but I think we've got to keep that context for the whole of the global market, because it does have a huge impact on the emissions of where you manufacture as well as what you manufacture.
And actually, if I can just jump in there as well, I think one of the things that's going to be increasingly important is the work that the Global Battery Alliance is doing on a battery passport, which will actually be a sort of QR code that attaches to the battery that consumers can scan with a phone and see that full traceability of where that battery's come from, right from the sort of human rights associated with mining the raw materials, right the way through the manufacturing process and the energy that's being used. So that work's still in development, and there was a pilot launched at Davos a couple of weeks ago. But I think as that project matures and we get that full traceability, that's going to become really important to assessing the full end-to-end life cycle emissions.
Thanks, Laura. That's good. Good input on that one. If I may, I'll move to a couple of questions that are sort of linked to what you've been saying there about the traceability. I think while Al-Maziri has asked a couple of technical questions. One about should we layer in the fuel cell vehicles, battery vehicles into the mix? Some of the laggards may have a mover advantage there. Is that an important technology? And also, all electricity inputs to the manufacturing process need to be certified in terms of the energy attributes, including capex emissions already implemented for aluminium inputs, etc. So I think, yeah, encapsulating that's thinking about the life cycle impact of EVs against incumbent technologies. From the panelists, who would like to step into that one first, about that traceability, and also about whether the fuel cell battery vehicles are potential input to this analysis?
I'll leave the fuel cell question to someone else, but I think on that traceability, that's exactly what the work of the Global Battery Alliance and the battery passport is seeking to do. And whilst at the moment they're focused on greenhouse gas emissions and I think human rights, that will expand once the proof of concept is sort of working. So there's a big coalition of people looking at that, and we're linked into it from a finance perspective, because we're very conscious that actually investors who are looking to invest into these manufacturers and battery manufacturers and the whole life cycle want to understand the real sort of ESG and traceability of their investments. So we're making sure that actually the voice of investors is being considered in that passporting process, so that people can really understand what it is they're investing in.
I'll pick up that thread and say, we have some incredible work going on in the UK with startup companies actually looking at how they can tackle different parts of this challenge as well. So I'll just shout out Infios, who is a UK-based startup company looking at specifically this sort of supply chain traceability, which I think will also, as a broad topic, be really important to consumers in the future. And if we put this back onto the auto manufacturers, we've been living through a quite odd period, I would say, in the auto sector in terms of the manufacturers kind of having the controlling hand. I think that's been influenced by supply chain challenges, a real lack of availability of vehicles for lots of reasons. That's starting to right itself slowly. I think this is going to be a tough year, but it's starting to right itself. And then the buying power will come back to consumers in lots of ways. I think what Lauren's saying there is the one to kind of really keep an eye on, which is consumers starting to ask not just like, where can I get a vehicle, but where's that vehicle come from? Where have the components come from? And actually, I think then it brings it right back to these manufacturers, these legacy manufacturers, I should say, because we don't have, for example, Polestar on this list. And I think that would be quite an interesting sort of phase 2, which would be to compare, the very bold ambitions of Polestar and the very targeted action they're taking to produce a vehicle in a net zero way. So yeah, I think customers are going to start asking for this, and that's going to, also bring pressure to the manufacturers to go faster.
Thanks very much for that, Claire. That's good. I mean, maybe either of the Bens, did you want to pick up on the fuel cell question there?
I'll answer the other part of the question around fuel cells. I think for the passenger vehicle segment, I think the battery electric vehicle has kind of won that battle versus fuel cell. There were a few fuel cell vehicles available in the market a few years ago, but I really don't see fuel cell playing an important role within the passenger vehicle space for a number of different reasons. If you look at the efficiency side of hydrogen and actually producing hydrogen, it's not a very efficient process, and arguably if you're doing electrolysis through renewables, maybe it's better to directly charge a battery with renewables than it is to produce hydrogen. And just on the infrastructure as well, that's a huge problem right now. We haven't got any kind of good ways of storing hydrogen in an effective way, and also it's incredibly expensive to deploy a hydrogen refueling station. I think that's an important part of the important piece of the puzzle, because with electric cars, people often worry about where am I going to charge next, and am I going to have enough range? But the good thing is that if you can get an electric cable to somewhere, then more or less you can put a charger in the ground. The same can't be said for hydrogen. So I think hydrogen has a few problems that it needs to kind of iron out right now. Maybe it has applications in the heavy goods and commercial vehicle sector. That's to be seen. But I think for passenger vehicles, battery electric vehicles has certainly won that battle.
Thanks, Ben. We've got a question from Andrea Perales on EV price parity. How do you think about the increase in cost of lithium and nickel? Did you rate your companies on how strong their supply chains are in terms of securing volumes of these minerals? I think that's probably open to all the panel on that one. I think it's a recurring issue about is the supply chain going to be causing inflation in the EV supply chain? So who would like to kick that one off? So I'll pass that to Ben Nelms to start with, and then off to the rest.
Sure. Yeah, happy to get the ball rolling on that one. I mean, I think the way I see this is that as these global supply chains kind of develop and expand, we're going to see sort of bumps in the price, basically, and there will be temporary increases in the cost of some of the raw material inputs that will drive the investment in new extraction. Lithium is extremely abundant. I've no doubt we can meet the demand for lithium. The increase in the price, it will drive more extraction, and that will then reduce the price, and then at some point the demand for vehicles will pick up, and that will drive up the price again, and there will be more. This is just a story of a growing global supply chain, I think, on most of these minerals. I don't think any of these shortages of materials are really going to hold things back.
Maybe I'll pick up the baton there and say, that these are good questions right now, and when you zoom in to 2023, 24, I think it's a really good and important topic to be thinking about, is how does it impact the price sort of immediately in the coming months, but actually thinking ahead to those vehicle design cycles. Even with rapidly increasing design cycles, we're still looking at 3, 4, 5 years for new vehicles to come to market, and in that horizon we see new battery chemistries also coming to the fore. So actually, we're seeing right now Tesla, as an example, shifting a lot of their vehicle batteries from NMC to LFP batteries, and in fact BYD are their supplier. So there's some interesting kind of commercial arrangements going on there between the auto manufacturers as well. We're starting to see sodium-ion batteries and potentially, coming to a scale which certainly on a grid battery scale, we'll start to see that then coming through into vehicle batteries probably in the sort of 5+ year horizon. So someone like Lena in the UK, and that, again, shout out another startup in the UK looking at that right now. And then maybe in the 10 to 15 year horizon, we'll see solid state batteries coming through. So I think thinking about the auto timescales and batteries, we've got to think kind of broader and longer, and think about how those chemistries are going to change as well. So I think right now, yes, the price of lithium and nickel, exactly as Ben says, we're seeing that natural, supply and demand impacting pricing in the market. But there's a lot to look out for in the next 10 to 15 year horizon around batteries and auto.
Thanks, Claire.
Just to add to that, on the nickel side, prices have increased massively for nickel and other materials as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. So that's kind of a major reason why the prices for that material has increased so dramatically. And if you look at your battery prices over the last sort of 10 years or so, it's for the price per kilowatt hour, it's decreased year on year. And I think last year we saw price of batteries go up for the first time. So yeah, it is concerning that battery prices have perhaps increased. But as Claire mentioned, there are newer technologies coming into this space for batteries using different types of chemistries and materials. So I think that works as a hedge against certain material price increases. So yeah, I think the manufacturers themselves, they are obviously deeply concerned about getting supply of these critical battery materials, and we actually find that the manufacturers themselves are directly investing in mines and mining operations so they can secure that supply going forwards, because I think it could be a bottleneck for the industry potentially if automakers don't secure those battery materials now.
I think the other thing it might lead to is manufacturers looking at smaller batteries with slightly shorter ranges, because actually I think the focus to date has been on building batteries with longer and longer ranges because consumers think that's what they need. The reality is that the average driving distance in the UK is something around 25 miles per day. So if you are able to charge at home, and as the charging infrastructure builds out in the UK and people become more trusting of how quickly they can recharge those vehicles, I think consumers will start to get happier with shorter ranges, recognizing that actually for the majority of times, a shorter range is sufficient, and therefore you can put a smaller battery into the vehicle, which might help to overcome some of those challenges and bring the price down. I think the trouble is in the short term, you almost need to go through an ownership cycle of having an EV that does 200 or 300 miles, realizing you don't actually need an EV that does 200 or 300 miles, and then next time round being able to take one that's got a smaller battery. But I think at the moment, before consumers make that leap, they're just trying to replicate the petrol experience, and it's a big sort of perception versus reality challenge to get over.
Thanks, Lauren. I think it's really, you're right. I think the second best-selling EV in the world is the City EV, isn't it? The GM joint venture in China, which does exactly that, isn't it? 125 mile range, but everybody loves it because that's all they need. So I think interesting to see the flexibility, and it's been interesting as a chemist to have a long discussion on chemistry. I'm going to switch as the questions keep coming in. This one's for Lauren, from Anonymous, I'm afraid. But will we see more policy initiatives from a funding perspective for consumers and manufacturers to help with the automotive energy transition? So this is a sort of switch to the financing side of it from the chemistry side of it. Are you happy to take that, Lauren?
Yeah, I assume that means as in sort of government policy initiatives and grant funding and things becoming available. It's difficult to answer, isn't it? I think with government's limited ability to pour money out of nowhere, it's hard to see that there's going to be an awful lot more sort of grant funding available or plug-in car grants and things. I think what we're talking to them about is how can they use the money that they have got in a way that's smarter and crowds in private capital to enable some of this stuff the transition to be financed, rather than just giving out grants. So, for example, can they use the funding to guarantee or underpin lending from private sector? taking some of that first loss mechanism? Can they look at blending public and private finance together to invest into charging infrastructure or into the battery supply chain? Is there anything we can do to subsidise interest rates, for example, for on a means tested basis for consumers to help them get into electric vehicles? So there's things that I think they could do with existing pools that that could be more innovative. Whether or not there's going to be vast sums of money coming out in the budget on the 15th of March, I think we'll have to wait and see. But I'd be sceptical given all the other challenges in the UK at the moment with the NHS funding and social care and defence and everything else we've got to spend money on. But I guess it comes down to priorities, isn't it? The faster we do this net zero journey, a lot of what the Chris Skidmore report recently said, if we'd have gone at it sooner, we'll save a lot more in the long run. So difficult one to answer.
Just a related question on that had come in as well is probably to you, Lauren, again as well, is what's the landscape like for sustainable securitization and green collateral bonds, etc.? Is that another route, or is that?
I think so. We hosted a roundtable recently where we brought together investors, originators, and sort of ratings agencies as well, and actually discussed green securitization. And I think there's a number of barriers at the moment. The market isn't quite moving as fast as it should. That includes the fact there's not enough collateral around to securitize that's purely green at the moment. There just aren't the EVs. Those investors are still concerned about residual values. So even though we were sort of able to demonstrate, there's much more data available than there was a couple of years ago, they were still saying to us, well, that's not enough data. We want to go through a full cycle of a full financial cycle of this data. Which is just going to take time, and concerns again actually from them about how green electric vehicles actually were, which brought us back to the conversation about the battery passport. So I think where the focus might need to shift to is sort of transition finance, and what's the role in providing transition finance and actually making sure that we set the OEMs really stringent targets that they are then held to, and there's financial penalties associated if they don't meet those targets. Because I think there was an article last week from Barclays around the sustainable bond market, and actually saying there's concern from investors at the moment about the fact that these sustainability linked targets associated with these bonds aren't necessarily being held to, and there aren't the penalties if they're not achieving them. So I think that's something that we really need to make sure there's focus on, that targets are set and then the companies are held accountable.
Just to add to what Lauren just mentioned there, and I think investors, especially ones who are ESG focused, want the tools to invest in green asset classes in the auto sector, like green auto loan bonds that Lauren just mentioned. So currently there's no official framework for sustainable securitization, and I think there's some disagreement of whether the collateral needs to be green as well as the use of the proceeds. And actually, Carbon Tracker is currently writing a report on the auto loan ABS market, of which the Green Finance Institute will be contributing, and we'll be looking more into this topic.
Thanks. Any more on that one at the moment?
The only bit I'll pick up on there, I guess, is the point that Lauren was making about the residual values, and actually EVs as a subcategory of auto are still quite young, and there just aren't the data sets about. So I think one interesting angle that government could take on this is thinking about giving RV guarantee or RV backing or some kind of some confidence there, whilst the investment, I guess, industry and interest in EVs is still quite nascent. That would be quite innovative. That would be quite interesting to see. And the other things I think to just keep an eye on here is actually, whilst we're talking about passenger vehicles, I think a lot in this report and the focus for today, actually we haven't even scratched the surface of larger vehicles and freight. And actually in terms of that, where is there support needed? If you think about a large freight vehicle, they currently are 3 times more expensive than an ICE vehicle, and so most operators of freight vehicles are small to medium-sized enterprises in the UK. They just don't have the funds to go out and buy an EV 44-ton truck, even if they wanted to, which a lot of them really do. So I think there's some interesting kind of developments to come in that space as well. Not for today, but kind of for folks here who are looking for opportunity and interested in these different asset classes. Those larger vehicles are coming and they're going to need financing, and those companies are going to need help around the vehicle and the infrastructure. So I think broadly there's opportunity, but in the passenger vehicle space, I think we do need to be looking for those very innovative ways of working with financing, and as Lauren said, crowding in private finance, because we need to go as fast as we can.
Thanks, Claire. To a certain extent, okay, so we've got one question that's related to that, and I'm going to have to trust in you not to be in marketing mode, Claire, on this one. But an anonymous attendee would like to hear more about the Octopus leasing scheme, which I guess is what you've been, but more generally, what's the and how important is this type of mechanism in encouraging uptake of EVs?
Sure. Well, I mean, who wants to own things these days? Discuss. Okay, so you think about, there are folks who are very dedicated to CDs and vinyl, but most folks nowadays use Spotify or similar. Okay, so there's a whole well-worn path of not owning things, but leasing them or renting them. And so leasing is a great way to get into an EV, and that's what we focused on in Octopus electric vehicles. Specifically, we focused on salary sacrifice. The reason we did that is actually exactly to this point. The government dropped the benefit in kind tax rate to 0% in the tax year starting April 2020. It's still at 2%, and it will continue at 2% for the next 2 years. Then it's going to rise 3%, 4%, 5% in the years subsequent. So actually, in terms of an incentive, you can look at that as probably the only, I'm looking at Lauren to see if she's going to give me a nod, maybe the only incentive, I guess, in passenger vehicles, really, if you think about, salary sacrifice and benefit and business contract hire, because you are saving so much tax. So the salary sacrifice scheme has had this renaissance in the last couple of years, focused on electric vehicles. At Octopus, we've focused in on that. So we are helping companies set up a scheme which we administer, and it's purely EV, and it makes it really simple for the company to give this as an opportunity for their employees to get access to an EV at what we see as the cheapest price point. And for those employees, it's kind of low or no commitment, because over the 2, 3, 4 years of their lease term, they can then hand the car back at the end and get the next one. And I think that, again, is kind of back to what Ben Nelms was saying about the mobile phone adoption curve. It's that mobile phone kind of behaviors, actually. So not just the charging. So, plug your charger, opportunity charging your phone is very similar to your electric vehicle, but also that technology kind of increase is happening so fast, or the technology development is happening so fast. Actually, leasing a vehicle is also a great way to not feel tied into a particular kind of vehicle or experience, because it's moving on fast. And exactly to Lauren says, that one cycle of ownership can actually become one cycle of leasing, and then you change your vehicle to something that kind of suits your budget and also suits your day-to-day use of an EV. So that's what we've been doing at Octopus electric vehicles.
Thanks, Claire. I think that covers it well. I'm conscious of time a little bit, and there's a couple of questions to get through. I'm going to, okay. I'll go to the slightly meta level one to begin with, and there's possibly a few more specific ones we can get to. So if we could get the answers in fast and hard, that would be great. This will be for probably all the panel, but this could go on forever, so if we can keep it really short. What are your views on hybrid adoption and the contribution to net zero goals? Who wants to do that one? I'm not going to do it. I'd love to, but I'll pass it to the panel.
Sure, I can. I think I think we're not seeing that much growth in hybrid sales in the UK, and I think that's partly because we've now got public policy in the UK that is going to focus on the zero emissions vehicle totally, and we don't want to see wasted investment going into the production of more hybrid technologies, hybrid vehicles that often end up polluting a lot more than they say they do. They don't offer the running cost savings for the consumers. They often have very high maintenance and servicing costs as well. So there's lots of disadvantages to hybrids. So I think in Europe and in the UK, it's likely that they're not going to play a very big role ever. I suspect they will be overtaken fairly shortly by battery electric sales.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Ben there. I don't see hybrids playing a major role in kind of in meeting those emissions targets. Especially plug-in hybrids, which kind of assumes that the consumer will charge their vehicle every night and use it all the time, when that's just simply not the case. And actually, people don't drive plug-in hybrids perhaps how they should do. And one point that Ben mentioned there as well is that you're essentially carrying around two powertrains on the same vehicle, which gives you inefficiencies, extra complexity, which of course leads to additional cost as well. So, manufacturers developing hybrids and plug-in hybrids is a kind of like a halfway house, I'd say, to getting to those emissions reduction targets. And we believe that going all in on battery electric vehicles is a far better way of reaching those climate goals.
Thanks. Very quickly then, adding on to that, Andrea Perales again has asked a question. I think it's related. Are we expecting the EU IRA, I guess that's the Green New Deal, to have a meaningful impact on the EV transition? Will it force it closer to the, I guess, quicker to the BEVs rather than these step change ideas like hybrids? All panel, maybe kick off with Lauren on that one.
Oh God, I'm still not
sorry, hospital pass through there, Lauren. Sorry about that.
IRA one. I think something's needed, because a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is the focus is on the US, and real concerns from UK manufacturers about manufacturing moving to the US and firms moving there because of the sort of the more favourable investment environment. So it's definitely a concern, and something that the EU and the UK need to be looking at. So I would hope that whatever comes out starts to readdress that balance and make sure that we're not just losing all this manufacturing capability over to the US. But yeah, I'm not an expert economist, I'm afraid. Sorry.
I'm not an expert economist either. I'm a simple engineer, and the thing that I think we need to think about is we also have something around rules of origin, which are going to impact our manufacturing supply chains pretty soon. And right now, it's just not really that high on the agenda. It's not really being talked about a lot. But actually, we need to have these mechanisms to onshore or reshore manufacturing supply chains, and I think that needs to be our focus. So I think what Lauren's saying, I think, is there's been a significant actually impact, maybe more significant in terms of the awareness of what's going on in the US. I think it will start to turn into tangible outputs pretty soon. I'd be surprised if we don't see something from the EU. I think we need to look very close to home to see what our government is going to do now and over the next few months, because this is the moment to making those significant and lasting tangible commitments.
Thank you. Now we'll probably get time for one more question. I'm going to try for this one, which is a big one, but I'm giving you sort of like 20 seconds to answer. To each panelist, maybe starting with Lauren, then Claire, then the two Bens. Why are some automakers resisting the change of this automotive energy transition? There you go, Lauren, another easy one for you.
Yeah, thanks. I guess fear of change, cost, people at the top not really believing it's ever going to happen. Yeah, they'd probably be my 10 seconds worth of thoughts.
Claire?
I mean, yeah, what more can you say really, except, change is always hard, difficult, expensive. And, we've had 100 years plus of the auto industry. We're asking that industry to make a change in handfuls of years. It's a huge impact on their businesses. But as Lauren said, we need those at the top to commit to it, because it's going to need to happen. Otherwise, as I say, this survive to thrive is not going to happen for those businesses, and they will fall by the wayside.
Thank you. Ben Nelms? Yeah,
I think I agree entirely with what Lauren said. It's an expensive and difficult change, and so therefore it's especially vulnerable to fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So anybody who is sowing FUD and reasons to think that the transition to EVs may not happen, or that the technology is not going to be the one that is used for decarbonisation or or that consumers are turning against it. Anything like that, I think, is extremely risky and can be extremely impactful with senior executives at automotive companies.
Thank you, Ben. And Ben Scott, I'll have to give you 5 seconds here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, just to reiterate maybe some of the points, I think the automakers want to keep business as usual, and they want a long tail end to internal combustion engine vehicles, and they've been producing these types of vehicles for a long time with global manufacturing assets and supply chains that have become very efficient and streamlined to produce these EVs. So as a result, ICEs are quite profitable, and EVs are not as profitable. So ultimately it's futile, because resisting
resistance is futile.
Yeah, legislation and emissions is only becoming stricter. So yeah, it's
yeah. Thanks everybody for being listening and interacting today with us. That's been super questions. We will get back to you, as we said, if we can. Please follow up if you want more. You've got Ben and myself's emails to follow up with, and any feedback would be great. I'll thank the panelists. Thank you all so much for your time. And I will end. I've got one action left, which I have to go and find out if Ivan Tony drives an EV. Other than that, thanks very much for your time today. And hopefully we'll follow this up soon. Thanks for your help.